I still remember the day Noah was born. It was the happiest day of my life. The delivery room was bright, sterile, and filled with the hum of quiet urgency from nurses and doctors moving around us. But the moment I held him in my arms, everything else faded. His tiny fingers curled around mine, his face scrunched in a way that made my heart swell with an emotion I had never felt before. Love, pure and overwhelming. "You did amazing," I whispered to my wife, Emily, as she lay exhausted but glowing in the hospital bed. She smiled up at me, her eyes filled with tears, and in that moment, I was sure that nothing could ever break us. From the very beginning, Noah was mine in every possible way. He had my dark hair, my nose, even the same stubborn way of furrowing his brow when he was displeased. My parents cooed over him, my friends patted me on the back, and life settled into a new, beautiful rhythm. Midnight feedings, diaper changes, first giggles, I embraced them all. I wasn't just a father, I was Noah's father, and that was my greatest pride. Of course, parenthood was exhausting, but even in the hardest moments, Emily and I found a way to laugh through it. Late-night walks to soothe Noah's cries, ridiculous lullabies sung off-key, the whispered conversations in the dark when we should have been sleeping, we were a team. Looking back, I realize now that happiness can make you blind. When you believe in something too deeply, when you trust too much, you don't see the cracks forming beneath the surface. I was blissfully unaware that everything I knew, everything I believed in, was about to be shattered. Noah was growing fast, and life had settled into a familiar, comforting routine. Every evening, I would come home from work to find him waiting for me, his little arms reaching out as soon as he saw me. It didn't matter how exhausting my day had been, the moment I picked him up, his laughter made it all worth it. Emily and I had always been solid, or so I thought. Parenthood had changed us, of course, less sleep, more stress, but we were still in it together. Or at least, I believed we were. Then came the first moment of doubt. It happened on an ordinary afternoon when Noah was about 6 months old. We were visiting Emily's friend, Claire, who had just had a baby of her own. The house was filled with the soft chaos of new parenthood, bottles on the counter, a diaper bag overflowing on the couch. As the two women chatted, I sat in the living room bouncing Noah on my knee. Claire's husband, Adam, was there too, sipping a beer as we made small talk about sports, work, and the never-ending exhaustion of fatherhood. At one point, Adam leaned forward, studying Noah with an odd look. "You know," he said, tilting his head slightly, "he's got really light eyes for a baby with your coloring." I laughed, brushing it off. "Yeah, he's got Emily's eyes," I said. "Strong genes, I guess." Adam nodded, but there was something in his expression, something almost hesitant. Like he wanted to say more but thought better of it. The moment passed quickly, and I didn't think much of it at the time. But later that night, as I lay in bed watching Noah sleep in his crib, the comment surfaced again in my mind. I had never really questioned it before. But now, staring at Noah's tiny features, a strange unease settled in my chest. His light brown eyes, the delicate shape of his nose, the way his chin curved just slightly differently than mine, small things I had never noticed before. I shook the thought away. Doubt had no place in our home. Emily loved me. Noah was my son. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. After that night, something changed in me. It wasn't something dramatic, not at first. Life continued as it always had, but in the back of my mind, there was a whisper, a tiny, nagging voice that refused to go silent. I tried to ignore it. But doubt is a tricky thing. Once it takes root, it grows. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Noah was my son, I had no reason to question it. But I started noticing little things. The way Emily sometimes turned away too quickly when I mentioned how much Noah looked like her. The way certain people hesitated just a second too long before agreeing when I proudly said, "Doesn't he have my smile?" Still, I pushed the thoughts aside. I wasn't the kind of man who let paranoia get the best of him. Then, one evening, I found myself staring at old baby pictures. Emily was in the shower, and Noah was finally asleep after an hour of fussing. I sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through my phone, looking at pictures of myself as a baby. I had always thought Noah took after me, but now that I was really studying the photos, I wasn't so sure. I switched to pictures of Emily. There was a resemblance, of course. Noah had Emily's nose, her delicate features. But something still didn't sit right with me. A crazy thought crossed my mind, one that I immediately felt guilty for even considering. What if Noah wasn't mine? I shut off my phone and rubbed my temples. This was insane. I was driving myself crazy over nothing. Emily and I had been together for years before Noah came along. She had never given me a reason to doubt her loyalty. And yet, that doubt was still there, whispering, waiting. I don't know what pushed me over the edge. Maybe it was the way Emily hesitated when I casually joked about Noah inheriting my stubbornness. Maybe it was the way my mother once mentioned, offhandedly, that Noah didn't have the same chin as the men in my family. Whatever it was, one night, I found myself doing something I never imagined I would do. A DNA test. I hadn't planned it. I was at the pharmacy picking up diapers and formula when I saw it, a small, unassuming box on the shelf. A paternity test. My hands were sweating as I picked it up. I told myself it was just for peace of mind. Just to silence the ridiculous thoughts in my head. But deep down, I knew. When I got home, Emily was in the living room, rocking Noah to sleep. She smiled up at me, her eyes tired but warm. Rough night? Yeah, I said, forcing a smile. Picked up what we needed. I kissed her on the forehead, then went into the bathroom, locking the door behind me. I followed the instructions carefully, swabbing the inside of my cheek, then carefully collecting a sample from Noah while he slept. My hands trembled as I sealed the envelope, addressed it, and hid it in my briefcase, planning to send it off first thing in the morning. Then, I waited. Every day that passed felt like an eternity. I carried the secret like a weight in my chest, barely able to look at Emily without guilt twisting in my gut. I was betraying her trust. But what if she had betrayed mine first? The waiting was the worst part. Every day, I carried the secret inside me, pretending everything was fine while a storm raged beneath the surface. I still came home from work, still played with Noah, still kissed Emily goodnight. But I wasn't really there. My mind was stuck in an endless loop of questions, doubts, and the crushing guilt of what I had done. Emily noticed, of course. She wasn't the kind of woman to let things go unnoticed. "You've been quiet lately," she said one night as we lay in bed. "Is something wrong?" I turned to her, forcing a smile. "Just work stress," I lied. She reached out and squeezed my hand. "You can talk to me, you know." I nodded, but I couldn't say anything. If I opened my mouth, if I let even one word slip, I might confess everything. So I said nothing. The days blurred together. I kept checking my email, waiting for the results, flinching every time my phone buzzed. I had never been so afraid of an answer in my life. One evening, I came home to find Emily sitting on the couch, her laptop open, Noah babbling beside her. She looked up at me and smiled, but I could see the concern in her eyes. "Hey," she said. "I was just looking at baby pictures of us. Trying to see who Noah really takes after." My stomach twisted. I sat down next to her, glancing at the screen. There she was as a baby, all soft curls and bright eyes. Then a picture of me, with my chubby cheeks and dark hair. "See," she pointed. "I think he has your ears." I swallowed hard. "Yeah," I said. "Maybe." She frowned. "You don't sound convinced." I forced a chuckle. "I guess I just don't see it the same way you do." Emily studied me for a long moment before shaking her head with a small laugh. "You're overthinking again. You always do that." Maybe she was right. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe I was letting one offhand comment from Adam ruin something beautiful. But then, 3 days later, the email arrived. I was at work when my phone vibrated. The notification sat there on my screen, simple, unassuming. "Paternity test results are ready." For a long time, I just stared at it. My hands were cold as I opened the email, my breath caught somewhere in my throat. My eyes scanned the words, jumping ahead to the only sentence that mattered. Probability of paternity, 0%. The world around me went silent. I read it again. 0%. Noah wasn't mine. I felt like I had been punched in the chest. The room tilted slightly, the words blurring together as my pulse pounded in my ears. This had to be a mistake. I checked the names, the dates, the sample confirmation. Everything was correct. There was no mistake. I stood up abruptly, knocking over my chair. A couple of coworkers glanced at me, but I didn't care. I grabbed my phone and walked out of the office, barely able to breathe. Outside, the air was cool against my burning skin. I leaned against the wall, my hands shaking. Noah wasn't my son. Emily had lied to me. Everything I had built my life around, our love, our family, our future, it had all been based on a lie. And now, I had to decide what to do next. I don't remember driving home that night. One minute, I was outside my office, my whole world shattered by a single email. The next, I was pulling into our driveway, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The house looked the same as always, warm light glowing through the windows, the faint sound of Emily's laughter inside. It was a picture of everything I had believed in. Everything I had lost in the span of a single sentence. I stepped inside, and there she was, sitting on the couch with Noah in her lap, humming softly as she stroked his tiny hands. He let out a soft giggle, and for a moment, my heart clenched. None of this was his fault. He was just a baby, innocent and unaware of the storm brewing inside me. Emily looked up and smiled. "Hey, you're home early. How was work?" I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. How was I supposed to answer that? How was I supposed to stand here and pretend like everything was fine? I couldn't. "I know," I said. She frowned. "Know what?" I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet her eyes. "I know Noah isn't mine." For a second, everything froze. Her smile faded, her body tensed, and the color drained from her face. I had seen Emily in every emotion, joy, frustration, exhaustion, but I had never seen her look like this. What are you talking about?" she whispered. I took a step forward, my voice steady despite the fire burning inside me. "I did a test, Emily. A DNA test. And it came back with a 0% match." Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. She looked down at Noah, still cradled in her arms, then back up at me. You did a test. That's all you have to say?" My voice was rising now, shaking with something between fury and heartbreak. "I just told you I know the truth, and you're worried about the test." Tears welled in her eyes, but I didn't feel sympathy. "Not yet." "Jake, Who is he?" The question came out sharper than I intended, like a knife cutting through the air between us. She flinched. Who is he?" Her eyes darted away, her grip on Noah tightening. I took a deep breath, trying to keep control of myself. "Emily, don't lie to me again. I deserve the truth. Who is Noah's father?" She squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, as if gathering the strength to say the words. When she finally looked at me, her face was crumpled with guilt. "It was one time," she whispered. A mistake. It didn't mean anything. The air left my lungs. I had expected lies, denials, maybe even anger. But hearing her admit it, hearing her say it was a mistake, felt like the final blow. One moment of weakness had erased everything we had built together. Who? I asked again, my voice barely more than a whisper now. She hesitated before answering. Adam. I felt my stomach drop. Adam. Claire's husband. The man who had made that offhand comment about Noah's eyes. The man I had laughed with, shared drinks with, trusted. I turned away, pressing a hand to my forehead as nausea rolled through me. It wasn't just a random stranger. It was someone I knew. Someone I had let into my home, into my life. I am so sorry, Emily said, her voice shaking now. I never wanted this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you. I turned back to her, and when I spoke, my voice was eerily calm. But you did. She opened her mouth, but there was nothing left to say. I stared at the woman I had loved, the child I had raised as my own, and the life I no longer recognized. And then, without another word, I walked out the door. I drove aimlessly that night, the streets blurring past as my mind raced. The betrayal clung to me like a second skin, suffocating and inescapable. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Emily's face, crumpled with guilt. I heard her voice, it was one time. A mistake. And Adam. The thought of him made my hands tighten around the steering wheel. The man who had sat across from me at dinners, who had held his own child in the same room as mine, who had known, while I had been left in the dark. I didn't know where to go. I wasn't ready to talk to anyone, wasn't ready for questions or sympathy. I just needed space. At some point, I ended up in front of Lucas's house. My brother had always been the one I turned to when things got bad. I hadn't called ahead, but when I knocked, he answered in seconds, immediately frowning at the sight of me. Jake? What's going on? I stepped inside, the weight of everything making my knees weak. I sank onto his couch, rubbing a hand over my face. Noah's not mine. Lucas stared at me, his mouth slightly open. What? I let out a bitter laugh. Yeah. Did a DNA test. Got the results today. 0% match. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then, he sat down beside me. Jake, are you sure? I nodded. Emily admitted it. She had an affair. And you want to know the best part? I laughed again, though it came out broken. It's Adam. Adam, Lucas. Claire's husband. Lucas cursed under his breath. His hands clenched into fists. That, he exhaled sharply. That son of a... I shook my head. It doesn't even feel real. I've been raising that boy, loving him, thinking he was mine. My voice cracked. And now what? What the hell do I do now? Lucas ran a hand through his hair, his expression torn between anger and concern. You don't have to decide tonight. But you do need to figure out what you want, Jake. Do you want to stay? Do you want to fight for your marriage? Or is this, he hesitated. Is this too much to come back from? I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. The truth was, I didn't know. Could I stay in a marriage built on a lie? Could I keep raising Noah, knowing that every time I looked at him, I'd see Adam? And then there was Noah himself. He wasn't to blame for any of this. He was innocent. My love for him hadn't vanished the moment I read that email. He was still the boy I had rocked to sleep, whose first laugh had been at one of my terrible jokes, whose tiny fingers had clung to mine from the moment he was born. But was love enough? I stayed at Lucas's that night, staring at the ceiling, my mind running in circles. The weight of the decision ahead of me was crushing. By morning, I still had no answers. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't go back home. Not yet. I didn't go home the next day. Or the day after that. Lucas offered me his guest room, and I took it without argument. I wasn't ready to face Emily. Not yet. She called, several times, but I let the phone ring. Each time her name appeared on the screen, a fresh wave of anger and heartbreak crashed over me. I wasn't ready to hear her excuses. I wasn't ready to hear her beg. Most of all, I wasn't ready to hear her ask me to come home like any of this could be undone. On the third day, she sent me a message. Please come home. We need to talk. I stared at the words for a long time before locking my phone. What was there to talk about? That night, Lucas and I sat on his porch, beers in hand. He had been patient, giving me space, but I could see the questions burning in his eyes. You can't avoid her forever, he finally said. I exhaled slowly. I know. He took a sip of his beer, his gaze distant. What are you thinking? I ran a hand through my hair, exhausted. I don't know. Part of me wants to pack up and never look back. File for divorce, walk away, let her deal with the mess she created. Lucas nodded, waiting for me to continue. But then, there's Noah. I swallowed hard. I don't know how to just stop being his dad, Lucas. I don't know how to look at him and pretend the last 2 years didn't happen. Lucas was quiet for a long time before he spoke. You don't have to make that decision right now. But you do have to talk to Emily. I sighed. Yeah. The next morning, I drove home. It felt strange, pulling into the driveway, seeing our house standing there as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. When I stepped inside, Emily was in the kitchen, holding a cup of coffee in both hands like she needed it to keep from falling apart. She looked pale, exhausted. Her eyes were red, like she hadn't stopped crying since I left. When she saw me, she set the mug down carefully, as if one wrong move would shatter everything around her. Jake, she whispered. I stayed by the door, unsure if I could trust myself to move closer. The sight of her made my stomach twist. She exhaled shakily. I didn't think you were coming. I didn't respond. She wiped at her eyes, taking a step forward. I know you hate me. I clenched my jaw. I don't know what I feel. She nodded, as if she had expected that answer. Please, sit down. Just for a little while. Please. Against my better judgment, I did. She sat across from me at the table, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. I don't know what to say, she admitted. I don't know how to make this right. You can't. My voice was hoarse. She flinched but nodded. I deserve that. Silence stretched between us. Finally, I asked, how long have you known? Tears slipped down her cheeks. I suspected, she whispered. After Noah was born. But I convinced myself it wasn't true. I wanted him to be yours. I stared at her, disbelieving. You suspected and still let me believe. I cut myself off, my hands tightening into fists. I was scared, she said quickly. I didn't want to lose you. And I knew that if I told you the truth, I might. I let out a bitter laugh. So instead, you let me raise another man's child as my own. You let me build my whole life around a lie. Emily sobbed into her hands. I know. I know I did. And I will regret it for the rest of my life. I wanted to be furious. I was furious. But beneath all the rage, there was something else, something even worse. Grief. Because no matter how much I hated what she had done, I had loved her. And I had loved Noah. And I didn't know if I could walk away from that. Emily's sobs filled the room, but they barely registered. My mind was stuck on everything she had just admitted. She had suspected Noah wasn't mine. And yet, she had let me believe the lie. She had watched me hold him, love him, call him my son, all while carrying the weight of a secret she never intended to tell. I didn't know what was worse, the betrayal itself or the fact that she had let me build my life around something she knew could come crashing down at any moment. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my hands over my face, trying to think clearly. But my thoughts were tangled, knotted together with anger, heartbreak, and confusion. Emily wiped at her tears. I swear, Jake, I never meant to hurt you. I let out a bitter laugh. You keep saying that. But every choice you made hurt me. Her lower lip trembled. I love you. I shook my head. No, Emily. You don't get to say that. Love doesn't do this. A fresh wave of tears spilled down her face. I don't know how to fix this. There is no fixing this. My voice was flat, empty. She looked at me like she wanted to argue, like she wanted to reach across the table and pull me back into the life we had before. But there was no going back. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. I need to clear my head. Emily's eyes widened with panic. Please don't leave again. I'm not leaving, I said. Not yet. She nodded hesitantly, but I could see the fear in her eyes. I stepped outside, the cool evening air hitting my skin. My thoughts were spinning, but one thing was becoming painfully clear. I couldn't stay in this marriage. I could feel it in my bones, there was too much damage, too much betrayal. Even if I tried to forgive Emily, I would never be able to look at her the same way again. But then there was Noah. I sat down on the porch steps, staring out at the darkened street. He wasn't my blood, but he was still the child I had raised. Did that mean nothing? Could I really just walk away and pretend like he had never been my son? I didn't know. I didn't know. I closed my eyes, my heart pounding. There were no easy answers. No clear path forward. But one thing was certain. By the end of this, my life would never be the same again. I stayed outside for a long time, staring at the sky, listening to the distant hum of passing cars. I thought about my life before Noah, before Emily, before all of this. It felt like someone else's memories, like the person I had been was gone, replaced by a man I barely recognized. When I finally walked back inside, Emily was still sitting at the table, her face pale and exhausted. She looked up at me, hope flickering in her eyes. "Are you coming home?" she asked quietly. I shook my head. "No, Emily. I can't do this." She let out a small, broken sound, but I didn't waver. "I deserve better," I continued. "I deserve honesty. I deserve trust. And you took that from me." She nodded, wiping at her eyes, as if she had already known this was coming. "And Noah?" she whispered. My chest tightened. "I don't know," I admitted. "I love him. That hasn't changed. But I need time to figure out what that means now." Emily reached for my hand, but I stepped back. "Please," she said. "I don't want to lose you completely." I exhaled sharply. "You lost me the moment you lied." The words hung between us, heavy and final. That night, I packed my things. I wasn't sure where I was going, Lucas's house, maybe a hotel, but I knew I couldn't stay. As I was leaving, I paused outside Noah's room. He was fast asleep, his tiny chest rising and falling peacefully. I leaned against the doorframe, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Good night, buddy," I whispered. Then, I walked out the door. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. This was the end of one life and the beginning of another. And this time, it would be built on the truth.